All right, it's the top of the hour, so we'll get started. Welcome to our regular webinar series. I'm James Akula. I'm the Director of System Planning here at ESIG. We're a membership-based nonprofit organization committed to providing our members with objective information, resources, and networking opportunities in support of the energy transition. And we do this a number of ways through workshops, tutorials, webinars, blogs, working groups, task force activities, and producing technical resource materials. We, of course, have webinars just like this one. Our workshops and webinars are open to everyone, so please feel free to register anytime on the eSIG website. If you're new to eSIG, I strongly encourage you to follow up with us if you like what you hear, and I think you'll be pleasantly surprised. And you can find us on the web at www.esig.energy, as well as on LinkedIn, Facebook, and X. Now, before we begin, a few logistics. Please note that the participant lines will be muted during the webinar. For the Q&A session and questions, we'll be using Slido at slido.com, slido.com. So please go to slido.com and enter the code ESIG1, ESIG1 as the event code. The instructions are also at the bottom of the screen here. In addition, you'll have the ability to vote and thumbs up particular questions, and that will allow it to rise up in priority, and we'll answer those first. Now we'll plan to reserve 10 to 15 minutes at the very end of the hour for Q&A. And an email link will be provided once the video has been posted. We also provide short responses to any of the questions that don't get answered during this very, very brief hour. So now on to our topic, analyzing resource adequacy across the Eastern Interconnect using GridPath. Across North America, power is routinely exchanged across regional boundaries for one of the world's most complex and largest interconnected transmission networks. Yet despite this high degree of physical and operational integration, resource adequacy studies and planning processes remain largely siloed and region-specific, really failing to reflect the realities of a shared interconnected system. As resource mixes evolve, demand becomes more dynamic, and weather extremes grow more consequential. This disconnect between the physical and operational reality and planning practices can really create growing risks. They also present new opportunities. So today's webinar will present key findings from a wide area resource adequacy assessment of the Eastern Interconnect, conducted by GridLab and Telos Energy using open source GridPath platform. Now, of note, the study examines how interregional transmission across the EI can mitigate resource adequacy risk across diverse regions under different system conditions. It highlights how coordinated planning and regional diversity can improve reliability. A little bit about our speakers. Derek Stenclik is a founding partner of Telos Energy and is an industry leader in power grid planning, operations, and reliability. Derek has over a decade of experience in helping clients across the electric power industry navigate evolving markets, adapt to rapidly changing technologies, and accelerate clean energy integration. And Sam Hostetter, his colleague, is a senior power system analyst at Telos as well, and brings expertise in power system regulation and data analysis. For the past 5 years, Sam has worked closely with wholesale energy markets data and developed data visualizations and reports to a range of audiences. And we're really glad to have both Derek and Sam with us here today. So once again, please use Slido with the event code ESIG1 to ask your questions. Thank you again for joining us. And let's jump right in. I'll turn this over to Sam and Derek.
Great. Thank you so much, James. Again, my name's Derek Stenclik. Thank you all for joining. I'm here joined by my colleague, Sam Hostetter, and really here to present our work over the past year, working closely with GridLab on the Eastern Adequacy Resource Adequacy Assessment. A really exciting time to drop this report. I wish we could have said we planned it, but coming off the heels of a very hot week last week, I was quite literally sweating through it, both because of the heat, but also worried about what could happen right before the drop of this report. So a lot to learn from what was going on last week, and we pulled the numbers. the report. Thank you for dropping that in the chat just now. You can go find the slide deck. The full written report will be out later this week. And we have this slide deck that I'm going to be presenting today, along with a longer version, and also all of the code and data used for the analysis. So a pretty unique thing about this project that I'll get into shortly. But before I begin, real quick, what happened last week? We saw temperatures over 100 degrees across the eastern seaboard. We saw some really tight operating conditions. But more importantly, we saw pretty astounding interregional flows between regions. So basically, we pulled the data, PJM, the Southeast, and SPP, pretty big net exporters throughout the event. If you look over the course of the 3 days, beginning of last week, Circ Central, TBA, NISO, MISO, ISO New England, and Circ East, all pretty big net importers. And the numbers are pretty big. We're looking at 5 to 7 gigawatts of interchange, whether importer or exporter, across most of those markets. So pretty significant interchange. And without that interchange, I think we would have seen a much different story about resource adequacy over the past week and the reliability of the system. So what we're going to talk about today is how can we better plan for those types of wide area heat domes, wide area cold snaps, and how might we get a better insight into this broader wide area assessment of reliability risk. So quick highlight on the study overview. We had 3 real objectives coming to this. The first was just to conduct a resource adequacy analysis of the Eastern Interconnect to calculate near-term 2028 loss of load risk. So we took a very near-term view, and I would say a very conservative view, where we assumed load was increasing due to things like data center growth and other projections that we're getting out of the ISOs and out of the utilities, but with limited additions, and we'll get into that shortly. The second was really, in doing that, not just evaluate each region in the Eastern Interconnect, but really look at the role of interregional transmission and market assistance on resource adequacy in evaluating those regions. And then the third, importantly, and a pretty neat feature of this, is to develop a publicly available data set and model using the GridPath open source model that can be used by researchers, industry professionals, and any of you following along here today. So again, the link is in the chat. You can get a little bit more documentation and a longer slide deck along with that code and data set so you can run your own analysis. So I want to start quickly on why perform wide area assessments. And this is also a good shout out to some work that ESIG and myself am a part of around the next report coming out of the Redefining Resource Adequacy Task Force. So that report, slated to come out probably late summer sometime, is really talking about the need for wide area adequacy assessments at an interconnection level, a continental level, a national level, for a variety of reasons, right? We need just the nature of it is we have an interconnected power grid. A lot of regions are, in some respects, relying on interchange during some of their tight margin events and resource adequacy events. And yet very few are doing kind of holistic planning across that interconnected system. And there's, in my view, a strong need for that. The ESIG task force has been talking about this for the past several months, and they see a need, and really a lot of lessons learned from what's going on in Europe, where Europe does do a pan-European resource adequacy analysis of the interconnected system. I think a lot of best practices that we can apply here in North America, and a lot of progress that we've seen both in the work we've done here in this study over the past several months, but also work that's been going on at NERC and at DOE and at other places to really think about how we can capture the resource adequacy benefits of an interconnected grid and really better assess the risk of these wide area extreme weather events. So quick note on the GridPath RA toolkit. So again, this is an open source modeling, open source model for power system planners, researchers. Big shout out to Elaine Hart and Anna Maleva at Sylvan Energy Analytics. We're really standing on the shoulders of giants with this work. They put out about 2 or 3 years ago the Western US data set for the GridPath RA toolkit, which is performed a wide area adequacy assessment of the Western Interconnection. We're really, I want to say, replicating that, but taking those lessons learned and applying it to the Eastern Interconnect. And again, building on a lot of the work they did before us. Both of those data sets are now available. The Western data set has been available for a couple of years. Now the Eastern data set is also out. And again, it's an open source tool that anyone can get in and start to utilize. So now we'll get into a little bit of the meat of how we perform this analysis. So really the goal of this work was to evaluate chronological system operations across multiple weather years. So we looked at 12 weather years and then evaluated each of those across 75 outage draws of generator outages. So for each simulation that we performed, there was 900 years of simulation where we looked at every hour within that year, all 8760 hours. So it turns out to be about, for each portfolio, we evaluate about 8 million observations, hourly observations, where we're trying to measure loss of load risk during each of those hours and calculate a probability of lost load. The key thing here, as we start to see the system shift to more variable renewable energy, that requires us to look at an all hours assessment. And then as we shift to a system that's relying more on energy limited resources like battery storage, demand response, other types of storage, it's important that we get the hour to hour variation so we can see how those energy limited resources look. And again, also important here is the correlation, and the correlation not just by time. So we want to make sure the wind, the load, the solar is all correlated in the weather patterns, but also correlated across the regions. We want to make sure we're picking up on the large weather events that can cross over the entire Eastern Interconnection. You'll note, compared to some other resource adequacy studies that typically use a few decades worth of weather data, so typically 30 to 40 years of weather data, we reverted to a relatively smaller subset, 12 weather years. The reason for that is we really wanted to get that weather correlation. We didn't want to rely on temperature bootstrapping. We wanted to get load, wind, and solar on a very time synchronized basis without resampling in order to get the specifics of how these weather fronts move across the system. Again, for that reason, we chose to go with fewer years, but again, these are all measured years of data. They're not resampling based on temperature profiles that you typically see in resource adequacy assessments. So we evaluated 3 scenarios, and the main purpose of these 3 scenarios was to understand this market assistance and utilization of interregional transmission across the system. So typically, in most, especially in the Eastern Interconnection, most ISOs will either model their immediate neighbors or make an assumption around the imports that are available from their immediate neighbors. And typically that will be done in a few different ways. They will either model the resources and load in the neighbors, or again, some sort of proxy based on historical interchange during resource adequacy events. Oftentimes that will be an immediate neighbor away only, which is an important caveat. And the other piece is oftentimes there will be an additional constraint around the amount of imports that a region allows that during the resource adequacy events. And this is fundamentally a philosophical decision, like how much each region should be reliant on neighbors that they have no control over, no contracts over, that market assistance. But typically speaking, each utility, each ISO has some assumption around the market assistance that they are assuming that is available in their resource adequacy assessment, and therefore assuming is available for their capacity obligations in the either capacity market. There's an assumption that the amount of capacity being procured is reduced based on the assumption of that market assistance. And then in a vertically integrated utility, they'll often reduce the planning reserve margin that they're procuring resources to, again, based on this market assistance. So what we wanted to do with this work in the resource adequacy assessment is evaluate 3 scenarios where we are specifically adjusting the amount of interregional transfer capability that we are allowing in the model. Now, importantly, the we are not assuming new lines or new transmission being added. We're simply changing the way we're allowing the existing transfer capability to be utilized in the model. So an important caveat, no additional transmission being added to the system, but we're changing the assumption on how much we allow flows between regions. So the first scenario, what we call the no interregional transmission capability. In this example, we are not allowing interregional transfers between regions at all. So completely isolated them. The exception is we do have some interfaces within ISO. So PJM, we have 3 interfaces between east, south, and west. In SPP, we have SPP North, SPP South, and in MISO, we have 4 subregions. So in those cases, we allow internal transfers within the ISO, but we don't allow interregional transfers. So in that case, we are assuming each system is, quote unquote, an electrical island, so no market assistance. The third case, I'll jump to the third case, which is our technical transmission capability. This is we're allowing transfers between the regions up to their technical capability, up to the transfer capability between the regions. And that was based on the NERC interregional transfer capability study that dropped at the end of last year. So that's kind of our technical limit. And then the middle ground is what we call the RA import transmission capability. And this is, again, going back to that commentary I had before about how many times utilities, ISOs will artificially limit the amount of transfers that they allow in the RA models in during those risk periods. And so that's trying to be that middle ground and try to adopt whatever the ISOs are using for their RA assessments or whatever the utilities are using as well. So again, 3 scenarios. Going from the top down to the bottom, we are increasing the amount of allowed transfer capability on the system. All right. So I'll quickly kind of show those 3 scenarios, both in a visual format here. So this on the right-hand side is the study topology we used. We aggregated loads and resources within each of those bubbles, and we did kind of a pipe and bubble model, a transfer model of flows and interfaces within the region. So a few things to point out. The topology here, we borrowed from the NERC interregional transfer capability study. So if you recognize the topology, very similar to that, both in terms of the regions that we're modeling. So in general, we're modeling the NERC assessment areas for the Southeast, and then the ISOs are being split by in the case of PJM, MISO, and SPP by some internal transfers limits. Again, borrowing both the topology and the transfers from that NERC ITCS. And a couple other things you'll note is Canada, we are modeling as proxy imports, and same with the Western Interconnection and the Texas Interconnection based on historical observations. So in this topology, we have flows between each region modeled, and that's the lines you see here. We also have a simultaneous import where each region has a maximum import capability, and both of those are based on transfer capability studies that were performed again as part of that NERC ITCS analysis. So that's the overall topology. Now, the next slide, I'll talk through those 3 scenarios. Again, same thing I talked about earlier, but now in a map format or visual format. The no transmission, no interregional transmission scenario. Again, we model each region as an island with no transfers from no external assistance allowed at all. And the one caveat here is within an ISO, we're still allowing internal transfers. So within the PJM region, within the MISO region, within the SPP region, we still allow transfers up to the technical capability. In the RA, you'll see the dashed line. So now what we're trying to represent there is we are allowing some imports from the neighbors, but we are applying that artificial limit on the total import and that we're allowing into the region. Again, here we're now starting to bring in those external regions modeled as proxy generators. But again, the total amount of imports that are allowed are subject to essentially whatever the ISOs are assuming in their RA studies or what the utilities are assuming in their analysis. All the way over to the right, that's the scenario where we're allowing all the transfers up to their technical capability. And again, there is each line has a transfer capability in both directions that is different. And then we have a total import capability going into each of the regions. So what we're trying to do here is show, again, not adding transmission, just showing the amount of transfers we are allowing in the resource adequacy model in order to assess risk and assess interdependency of the system. And with that, again, it's coming from the NERC ITCS, but I'll hand it over to my colleague Sam, who will go over some of the inputs and assumptions and some of the results, and then I will pick back up shortly.
Thank you, Derek. So yeah, in this section of the slide deck, I wanted to go over some of the sort of assumptions that were pretty consistent across all of the scenarios, and so we can understand some of the inputs that went into this Eastern Interconnect study. So taking a look at the interregional transfer limits, on the left here, we have a representation of the coincident transfer capability or simultaneous import capability. These bars in blue represent the sort of total interface limits into each of the subregions listed, scaled as a percentage of peak load. So see at the top, we have MISO Central coming in just under 35% of their peak load as a total simultaneous import limit. So time point to time point limit on sort of how much transfer capability would be allowed into the region. And then you can compare that value to the sort of values we have here on the right. So taking a look at the non-coincident transfer capability. So this is the sum of individual ties. And you can see in many of these regions, the sum of individual ties is a much higher percentage of peak load than the interface capability limit. So sort of, yeah, we have this limit on top of a limit here on the left, sort of constraining the total amounts of individual ties that are allowed in each region during all hours of the simulation. Taking a look at another assumption that went into sort of all of the scenarios of the model here, we have generator capacities. So these values are presented on the right here as a percentage of total capacity for each region. We sort of aggregated the sub ISO regions into sort of their greater amounts, their greater regions here. And this data was gathered from the EIA 860 data forms, specifically the 2024 versions. And these capacities also account for retirements and new installations as of 2028. More specifically, the new installations, we only included projects under construction or with regulatory approval. And for retirements, we included all retirements with an effective date as of 2028. And diving a bit more specifically into those two categories of capacity, we can see representation of the total additions and retirements going into each region. Unfortunately, it seems like the legend has overlapped a little bit here, but the predominant theme shown here are the retirements, specifically coal retirements in that darker navy blue color. These coal retirements primarily occurred in SPP, MISO, CERC Central, and PJM. And also one thing to note here is we assumed a fairly conservative amount of generation additions. And this comes from our sort of assumption that we're only to include new generation that was either listed as under construction already or receiving regulatory approval in their respective regions.
And one thing, thanks, Sam. One thing I'll add to that is we took the approach of being intentionally conservative here, not trying to project out that no additions beyond this are going to be added. But we really want to take a conservative view. What if we have these announced retirements and there's delays and slowdowns in bringing new resources on? And we wanted to quantify that risk and understand how interregional transfers might mitigate some of that risk. So again, when we think about the framing of the study, we're assuming load growth continues as the ISOs and the utilities are expecting. We're assuming retirements continue as announced. But then we're taking a conservative view on the resources to try to quantify, well, what are the gaps? Thank you, Sam.
Yep. Thank you. And then moving on here, we have a look at the different weather year specific inputs that we used in the study. We modeled over two different groups of weather years. So from 2007 to 2013, we pulled hourly load profiles and hourly wind and solar profiles from sort of a modeled synthetic data set, specifically the NREL reads data set. We performed a scaler on these data sets to align the peak load from the synthetic data with forecasted peak load in 2028 for the based on according to ISO forecasts if they exist, or the NERC 2024 LTRA forecast for the non-ISO regions. A similar scaling was done for load profiles on the sort of latter group here, the historic and actual load data from 2019 through 2023. We performed a similar scaling process to bring the peak load from those profiles up to 2028 forecasts.
And Sam, I just saw a question come in on the slide, so I'll answer it while we're on the slide. So why were these years chosen? Couple reasons. The main ones are, when I talked about earlier, we really wanted consistent data sets applied, and we didn't want to rely on resampling of weather data. So the 2007 to 2013, for those who kind of follow the weather data in the industry, we relied on the NREL Wind Toolkit for that data, as well as the NREL reads model for the load profiles that were weather-dependent load profiles that they utilized in reads that were developed by Evolved Energy Research. And so we had a nice data set of wind, solar, and load that were all correlated, all for the same years, and we didn't have to, again, rely on resampling. And that's really each of those three data sets have different years that are available, but these are the 7 that are consistent across those data sets. And then why we chose the last 5 from 2019 to 2023. So this is actual data that we did some scaling to bring it up to a 2028 target year. But that's really where we have consistent data on an hourly basis for each region collected through the EIA Form 930. So why we chose those years was really based on data availability more than anything else. And we didn't apply any different probabilities. We're assuming all years have the same probability. So thanks, Sam. I just saw the question come in, so I figured we'd hit it as it came up.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate the additional commentary there. All right, so following our input assumptions, we can start taking a look at some of the results of our Eastern Interconnect study. So as a sort of overview, here we have 3 different risk maps colored in depending on which of the 3 scenarios, or how many of the 3 scenarios each of the regions we studied exhibited greater than 0.1 days of loss of load expectation. So beginning here on the left, all of the regions colored in yellow exhibited sort of moderate risk, so greater than 0.1 days for in the no transmission scenario. So this was our most restrictive sort of transmission scenario. Most of the regions were sort of treated as energy islands, as Derek had mentioned earlier. Then stepping up to the RA transmission scenario in the middle here, the regions depicted in orange here also exhibited greater than 0.1 days of loss of load risk. And sort of this is indicating that even when relaxing some of those more stricter transmission constraints in the no TX scenario, these 5 regions still exhibited some elevated risk of loss of load in our simulations. And then finally, on the far right, we have the 3 high-risk regions of SPP North, SPP South, and PJM South. And these 3 regions ultimately exhibited greater than 0.1 days per year of LOLE in all scenarios, even with full transfer capability as signified by that full TX marker. So these were the three regions that, we saw consistent risk across all of our transmission scenarios. All right, moving on. So now taking a closer look at the specific values that we've simulated across our sort of 900 iterations of simulating the Eastern Interconnect. The bars shown here are sort of additive bars across the three scenarios. So each color represents additional risk seen in the additional scenario as we restricted transmission further. So beginning with the green bar, that's risk exhibited in our full transmission scenario by region, as well as the total Eastern Interconnect on the far right of each chart. We also then see additional risk faced in the RA transmission in light blue, and then the total risk faced in all three systems, or in all three scenarios for the regions. One important thing to note when looking at this chart is specifically, I would take a look at PJM. So we can see that across the three scenarios in the chart on the left, looking at loss of load expectation days per year, we see not that much change from the full transmission scenario up to the no transmission scenario. It starts out largely in green and does not have much incremental risk added as we restrict transmission further. And this was sort of a unique observation for that region compared to the other regions where we typically see most of the risk being exhibited in the more restrictive scenarios. And now taking a look at a more broad look at the system-wide risk. One caveat to highlight before sort of diving into these system-wide charts is during this wide area assessment, a loss of load event occurs when there's unserved energy anywhere in the Eastern Interconnect. So in any given hour, in any given region, if there's unserved energy, that counts as a system-wide event. And the sort of when looking at these loss of load expectations by month, we see largely summer risk exhibited in the Eastern Interconnect study, with steady decreases in the system-wide event risk as more transmission is introduced into the study. And one note that we have here on the slide that I'll touch on why we see limited winter risk is largely due to not modeling correlated outages and fuel supply that is typically seen in winter periods that would introduce probably more risk into those periods rather than the summer periods with simply just higher loads historically.
Thanks, Sam, for touching on that. I want to add a little more color commentary because in our full report and in the full slide deck, I think we have a lot of caveats that point to this point. And then as we were going through this abbreviated version, I realized we didn't hit some of those limitations up front. This is a big limitation of the study. We did not evaluate correlated weather-dependent outage risk of the thermal fleet, both due to natural gas fuel supply disruptions that we've seen hit the East Coast or just extreme cold increase in forced outage rates that we see during these events. We did a lot of work to get that into the model. Really, the limitation here is we wanted a consistent data set that was utilize actual observed outage rates that we could apply to all regions. We had very good data that was publicly available for some regions, but not all. We wanted to not kind of cherry pick what data was available. We've also been working with NERC, have done a lot of work using kind of daily GADS data for all the regions. I think that's something that was input into the NERC interregional transfer capability study. I'm hopeful that we can leverage that, make portions of that public so that we can use it, that anybody can use it in analysis like this. So unfortunately, we did not get correlated weather-dependent outage risk in this version of the model. It is very high on our priority of an additional feature, additional scenario that we plan to run as soon as we can. But an important caveat. Thank you, Sam, for touching on it too. You see a lot of orange bars, different shades of orange, a lot of risk concentrated in June, July, August, September. Only a little bit of blue. I think you're seeing Winter Storm Elliott pop up there, if I'm not mistaken. We see a few times where that did cause unserved energy. But again, we are acknowledging that we're not capturing that correlated outage risk on the thermal fleet.
Yeah, thank you for that, Derek. And I want to also highlight, I see some questions rolling in regarding sort of how to interpret some of these results shown here. The sort of values that you see correlated to the y-axis is additive, right? So within the no transmission scenario, for example, we saw about just over 18 loss of load days per year across the system. And like I said, it's a very inclusive metric, given any loss of load exhibited in any region counts as an event for the entire Eastern Interconnect. Okay, so taking a sort of closer look at the month-to-month risk, we have some heat maps here showing within each month, shown on the x-axis below, which hours of the day do you see the highest probability of loss of load occurring? And this probability is calculated across all hour of day, month combinations across all of our 900 samples in each of these scenarios. And the common theme that you see across all scenarios is summer risk, specifically summer evening risk. So the later hours of the day, predominantly hour ending 14 through 20 in months July through August. And one you can see also as sort of inter-regional transmission is increased from left to right, we see decreased loss of load probability, as you'd expect across the Eastern Interconnect. Taking a deeper dive into the sort of brightest heat map from the last slide, taking a look at the no transmission scenario, we have a region by region breakdown of a sort of hour month probability of loss of load events. You can see SPP and PJM providing or demonstrating the largest amount of risk among all of the regions, and a very slight shaded bar for Cirque Central in the winter. That's the limit of our winter risk exhibited in our data, predominantly around winter storm Elliott, I believe. Some more statistics about the events we calculated across the system. So across the Eastern Interconnect and across all three scenarios, we see most events coming in at less than 5 gigawatts in maximum unserved energy in an hour. And as you go from left to right and increase interregional transmission availability, you see much smaller magnitude of events. So sort of the peak unserved energy is much smaller in most of these events as you increase transmission availability. And you see a similar story when looking at the duration of events. So majority of events happen in the 4 to 6 hour range. And with full transmission, we see remaining events are relatively short and can be potentially even mitigated by shorter duration storage. Moving on to a weather year analysis here, we see in both the no transmission scenarios and RA transmission scenarios, a couple weather years stand out with the largest loss of load hours per year, specifically the 2012 summer heat wave and the 2023 summer heat wave, both peaked in both scenarios as sort of instances of high load across the Eastern Interconnect. And increased risk as a result. Another visualization we have of events exhibited in the study, we have on the y-axis here all the different weather years we simulated and each of these dots shown represent an event that occurred within the simulation, and I've highlighted in brackets a few of the large heat waves in 2012 and 2023. The size of the dots represent the maximum unserved energy shown in the event, and the colors of the dot demonstrates represents the duration of the events, going from at or below 1 hour to above 10 hours in duration, shown in the bright yellow color, specifically in 2023, I believe. And then one region we wanted to sort of highlight specifically, I mentioned it prior, was PJM South. So PJM South was unique against most of the other regions we studied in that regardless of the transmission scenario, the region exhibited high loss of load risk, across all the scenarios, largely due to sort of a lack of native capacity or a lack of transmission able to bring capacity into the region. So to address this risk, we introduced 3 sensitivities. Sensitivity A of capacity additions, we added 4 gigawatts of battery storage, mirrored with about 4 gigawatts of additional renewables into the region. Scenario B, we took a different approach. We added 4 gigawatts to PJM South's total import limit, bringing it to just under 14 gigawatts in total. And then scenario sensitivity C, we took about half of the capacity and import transmission values and added it to the PJM South region. And taking a look at the table here on the right, we see significant decrease in loss of load risk, down from over 5 days of loss of load risk in the no transmission scenario to under 0.1 for sensitivity A and C, demonstrating that even just sort of a fraction of the interconnection queue that's available, trying to interconnect into PJM South can have some significant impact in decreasing the loss of load risk, and these capacity additions are largely renewables. And even so, we can take a mix in sensitivity C and exhibit similar results in decreasing the loss of load risk in the region.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. I think one other thing to add here is just kind of putting this type of analysis in context and kind of the overall changes that are happening in the industry. So again, we're assuming this is PJM South, this is data center alley, right? This is where we're seeing just rapid growth in data centers that's embedded in the forecast that we're looking at. We're also seeing a lot of coal and gas retirements taking place in that region. So I don't think it surprises anybody that we're seeing PJM South with limited additions showing up at high risk. But I think where we really wanted to show this is there's options available, and it's not just kind of keeping legacy units online and doing so out of market, but it's really about how can we accelerate interconnection of new resources. There's a very large queue in the region of wind, solar, batteries. We showed a portion of that. If we could accelerate that, get that into the system, that would certainly help with the resource adequacy risk and bring it very much in line below the reliability criterion. But also there's an option for additional transmission, combination of the two. Obviously with transmission, we're dealing with longer lead times for new transmission, but the big thing here is we're adjusting the total import capability, which doesn't necessarily always need to be new transmission lines. There's other levers you can use to increase the transfer capability. That's not just adding new transmission, and a combination of the two. So I think the key thing here is there is first looking at interregional transfers as options for improving reliability. We've seen that across the entire study, but also there's still going to be some remaining risk. We're not trying to downplay the resource adequacy challenges that we're seeing across the industry right now. We're really trying to highlight that the solution, in my view, to that is accelerating the interconnection of new resources, making sure we can bring those on in a timely fashion. I think given some of the challenges that we've seen in the industry over the past few days, making sure we have policies and regulations to help enable that. All right, so I'll wrap up just 2 more minutes, and then we'll switch over to some some Q&A. So key findings, I touched on all of these. Again, we are seeing in that situation with limited new additions and all the announced retirements and demand growth, we are seeing resource adequacy risk increase across the Eastern Interconnection. The key thing there is the assumption on the amount of external assistance really changes the view. And so if you go back, if we can get across anything, is that map that showed yellow, orange, red, again, no new addition, no new transmission being added in those portfolios. It's just the assumption on what we let the model utilize. And really what that highlights to me is the need for coherent, wide area collaboration in that planning process and making sure each region has some assumption on their reliance on neighbors, but not all regions are really doing a lot of due diligence in understanding the risk and opportunities that are available in that interregional transfers. And lastly, where are we going from here? Again, I will say this is the start of this GridPath toolkit and data set. We really want to continue leveraging it. We really want all of you to continue to leverage it and utilize it. And there's opportunities both on the data development and making the analysis more robust, and then what we use it for. So what we use it for, I think there's a lot of opportunity around evaluating new clean energy portfolios or new resource additions, increased transmission scenarios. So can we interconnect the regions further, and can we use this to really harmonize our accreditation processes, not just for generating resources across regions, but actually apply that to transmission as well. And then there's 3 ways I think we can improve and augment the data set that we have already today. We can add additional load years, again, move beyond the 12 and bring in more weather and climate data, and importantly, add the weather dependent outage rates that we were talking about earlier. So a lot of work to do. I will say this is the start of something, not the end. And hopefully, again, that can be collaborative. And that's really why we made this an open source tool. So with that, I will, again, just note the link to the report is in the chat. So please go check it out. We have a full slide deck, the slide deck we just shared with you. This webinar will also be posted on the ESIG website with the recording. We also have a link to the code and the data set that we use, along with some appendices and tables. The written report will be out targeting later this week, maybe early next week, depending on how the holiday falls, just in the final throes of that right now. So looking forward to some of the Q&A. And James, if you want to MC it, I have the Slido up on my screen as well.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Derek and Sam, for that engaging presentation. We have 23 questions in Slido, which means I can ask the 52 that I had after looking at the slide deck over the last day and a half here. So I'll combine 2 here that are struggling for. Number 1, that are related to modeling and some of the simulation. We'll start with how are coincident transmission lines determined? Obviously, a critical assumption in this study, right? So how is that transmission limits determined? And then how are power flows simulations, are those considered in this study? How are they considered if they are considered at all?
Yeah, thanks for lumping both these together. I was going to do the same thing. So I'll start with are power flows being considered in the study? The short answer is yes, they are. The transfer limits that we have from region to region and the total import capability are based on transfer analysis conducted in power flow simulation. So those transfer limits, while we are not modeling the AC power flow in the GridPath tool and in the actual RA simulations, the transfer limits between regions and the total import are based on transfer analysis conducted in Terra and evaluating the power flow constraints N-1 and N-1 constraints. So that power flow is being represented. Again, we're not doing a nodal AC or DC power flow simulation in GridPath, but we are using power flow simulation for those transfers. I'll kind of add to that the coincident transfer limits. That was done. So each region to region transfer was done by kind of making one region the sink and the other region, the exporting region, the source, and you kind of continue pushing the source and sink and forcing more transfers until you hit limits. And that's how those region to region transfers were conducted. And then the coincident was done the same way, except one region was made the sink and then all of the neighbors were made the source. And so the increase flows from all of the neighbors simultaneously into the region again until constraints were hit. All of that very well documented in the NERC ITCS. One of the reasons we started this project actually a year ago, one of the reasons we kind of put it on hold until that NERC ITCS was done, really so we could leverage the output of it. So we didn't have to come up with our own transfer capability. We wanted to use the output of that study as an input into the study. So you can find more if you just go to the NERC ITCS website for those transfers.
Great, thank you. So there's a question here about comments from the MISA Independent Market Monitor on NERC's LTRA, the most recent one. And I think there's a couple of layers to that question. One, a question on your thoughts about the LTRA and how well it serves as a wide area assessment. Two, how the data is collected and fed in through the process, which it seems like there was a mismatch there in the data that was released and what the risk was. And then three, to the IMM's comment about MISA being shown as having elevated risk and yet having some of the largest interregional transfer capability, right? How do you square those two? So I think those three questions are embedded in that one about Dr. Patton's comments.
Yeah, a lot to unpack here. I probably don't have enough time to do it justice, so I'll be relatively quick. So I saw both the RA Tech Conference at FERC and those comments, as well as the exchange afterwards, and NERC kind of acknowledging the data issue. So first and foremost, this analysis utilized EIA 860 data. We aggregated up into those regions, so we're not relying on that data that was used. I want to make that caveat. The second, maybe on the data collection issue, I think I've actually been very close and intimately involved in kind of the NERC data collection and seeing how that's done. I think there's a lot of improvements that NERC already had underway even before this. I mean, I know they have plans to continue improving that. I would say the big takeaway for this type of wide area adequacy assessment, and going back to like that ESIG task force and the ESIG report that's coming out at the end of the summer, is really a need to have this planning be collaborative. So obviously we didn't do it here in this study. And so I'm sure there's issues in our inputs and assumptions. We try to do our best. But the key thing here is we need broad industry engagement in all of this, so that we have the ISOs, we have the utilities directly engaging in these wide area adequacy assessments. We're sharing data bottoms up into these wide area assessments, and then the outputs of these wide area assessments can be fed back down into the local assessments. I think that's the key takeaway of the ESIG report that's going to be coming out. So just more collaboration in general. And then just that last comment around MISO being very interconnected and showing up as high risk. I think that's the nature of both how the LTRA is conducted, but just how regions do resource adequacy analysis. They'll typically not acknowledge or utilize all of that transfer capability that's available. And for good reasons. They're in charge of reliability of their footprint and want to make sure they can serve their load using their resources. But recognizing that broader interregional transfer capability to improve reliability as a really good opportunity on an asset. And then lastly, on just the LTRA, and I think my view here is the LTRA is a deterministic snapshot. It's trying to look at on peak periods and the availability of resources. I think there's a real need, like we're showing here, to go into that probabilistic assessment, go into every hour of the year, understanding how these things evolve, how risk evolves over the course of the year, over the course of the day. And I know NERC is doing a lot of work with that, both in their Prov A and their energy adequacy assessment. So a lot of improvements going on right now.
Great, thank you for compacting all of that into a fairly concise answer. I know that could have gone for another hour or so.
Yes.
Just moving on then, a question about slide 13, looking at the mismatch between the amount of retirements and the resource additions. And the question is that mismatch actually driving a lot of the resource adequacy issues, and how is that impacting the results that we're seeing from this and the impact of interregional transmission, just because of the size of that gap as a starting point?
Yeah, certainly. And that, again, it was intentional. We wanted to take that conservative view of the announced retirements, but only including the under construction and projects that had all regulatory approvals. There's also a delay in the EIA 860, just in general. I think we're using the 2023 vintage. So there's like a collection delay, and then by the time they get it out and the time we conducted the study. So there's a delay. Probably most of those under construction are now actually operating, and there's a new wave of stuff that's under construction. So again, we talk about this a little bit more in the caveats of the report. We're not trying to say, here's the reliability risk that we're going to expect in 2028. We fully expect more resources will come online. So we intentionally wanted to, A, be conservative, B, show a system that had resource adequacy risk to begin with, to then show how interregional transfers could mitigate that. So yeah, certainly I think a lot of room to get more specific about, I guess the big takeaway for this study is, don't hang a hat and say this is the resource adequacy risk that we should expect in 2028. I think the purpose of this study is to show, given resource adequacy risk, how can interregional transfers and interregional transmission mitigate that risk, whether it occurs in 2028 or 2030. I think that's really the purpose of this study, not to measure any one region.
Great. I am going to jump around a little bit here. So a question about the internal transmission limits, which you have modeled. How are those limits restricting the deliverability of surplus capacity? So are there internal limits that are going to have impact on what you can actually import and utilize your interregional transfer capability? We've talked about interregional transmission here. How do we think about the relationship between intra regional constraints?
So I think there's two pieces of that. Even within a region, there might be deliverability issues and you could foresee curtailments occurring or resources that are not able to fully output due to internal transmission congestion. Now, hopefully that is mitigated by the regional topology that we looked at, but there's probably some local deliverability constraints that are still there. I think there's still work in general in the RA community and how we reflect those in probabilistic RA studies, recognizing that it's, in my view, not worth the time and effort to go nodally on RA assessments, but better crafting of local capacity zones. So if we know there's a deliverability constraint or a local zone, we should just refine that capacity zone in our RA models a little bit more coherently. The second one on, does any intra-regional transmission congestion affect the ability of the interregional transfers? The answer is certainly yes. I'm not sure to the extent of how much. I know in the NERC ITCS, again, that we relied on, that tried to capture some of those dynamics by using the actual AC power flow analysis. So a transfer limit from one region to another might just be one small element that's triggering a limit on the total transfer. So again, we tried to reflect that in the way the transfers were used.
All right, great, thank you. We still have a ton of more questions, but we are out of time, unfortunately. But Derek and Sam will take the time to respond to the questions that were not answered in writing, and that will be posted along with the recording of this meeting. So thank you so much, Derek. Thank you so much, Sam. We really appreciate you taking the time to share the findings from your study and creating the models and the data that you are going to be making available as well. And thank you so much to everyone that was able to join in and dial into this conversation. We hope that you will join us for other webinars. Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your day.
All right. Thank you, James. Thank you all.
Thank you.